Alright, hello and welcome back to Left Inside. I'm your host Dermot Flood, back again after a bit of an absence. This week we're shifting focus and having a chat about what's going on in America at the moment, and in order to do this, I'm delighted to be joined on the line by Whitney Kahn, a member of Reform and Revolution, a Marxist caucus within the Democratic Socialists of America. Thanks a million for joining me, Whitney.
Hey, happy to be here.
It's great to have you here. So, we had intended to discuss the general political situation in the US, but I think it would be an oversight if we didn't first discuss the recent demonstrations in Minneapolis in reaction to the murder of George Floyd by the police. We're currently recording this on Thursday the 28th, at the start of what seems to be an unravelling situation. How would you describe what's taking place from where you are and the reaction to it?
Yeah, there's, I think, a lot to get into there. There were these, mass protests in Minneapolis, which have now, there have been burned buildings, a lot of property destruction. One thing notable about what's going on in Minneapolis is that so far as I can tell from DSA members on the ground, from news reports, no one has died. The only person who still has died from any of that is George Floyd, who died at the hands of the police, being stepped on for 9 minutes while he said he couldn't breathe. And there's definitely a lot of people who are condemning it, who are condemning the protests and the burning that's going on there. I think it's really the most thing we said for it is that, rioting is the language of the unheard. And this has just gone on for years and years and years. Minneapolis is the city of Philando Castile, who was in his car. And if anyone, it's this horrifying video where the police end up shooting him point blank when he was telling them he was reaching for his registered firearm to show him the paperwork for this thing. This is just time after time, people haven't gotten justice for these killings. In the US, the police kill 1,000 people a year, and that hasn't seemed to slow down during the pandemic. There was Breonna Taylor, who was a paramedic who was recently killed in her apartment at 2 o'clock in the morning. When the police stormed it, they later said, oh, they had the wrong apartment. They stormed it and shot her and killed her in her own apartment, completely unprovoked. And there's just no justice. And it goes on and on and on. And at this point, people are so desperate for something to happen. There's a similar phenomenon in the 60s with the Watts rebellions in 1965. And then you've got people like Trump going on Twitter and saying, if the looting starts, the shooting starts. I mean, the only people who are getting killed in this situation are still at the hands of the police. And it's the most abhorrent thing. But there are people who are condemning it, and those are largely the people who have not been condemning the 1,000 killings a year that have gone on to the hands of the police, which is, in my opinion, the real violence going on. I'd rather everything got burned down and no one got killed.
Yeah, a lot of the reaction seems to portray this as an isolated incident, but there's been a long line of police shootings of unarmed black men in recent history, and comparisons between Michael Brown and Ferguson at the Eric Garner incident, and then George Floyd now currently, and all of this came from stops for absolutely minor offences. I think George Floyd specifically, they tallied up the bill of, I think it was fake cigarettes or something, and it was like $20. But it raises the issue again of the growing militarization of the police force in America. I think rates of crime have dropped over the years, but the budgets for police departments have vastly increased, and there's that kind of disconnect between the two.
I just have does this, I don't know if in other countries, if this would even, there are 40 million kids. I'm a teacher, right? And you were talking about how these other budgets are getting cut, and we've been cut every year. Yeah. Less counselors, all this stuff. There are now over 40 million kids in the US who go to school every day in a school that has a police officer at the school, no counselor. Does that have any sort of comparison to Ireland?
Well, I always think the contrast is always much more extreme in America. I do think there's comparisons maybe in how the funding is allocated. I think you can always see like you see where the priority is with funding, and I think with America, where there will be people, especially now, suffering during the pandemic with their payments. Like I was reading earlier, with people waiting like 9 weeks for their payments to come through, but yet you look at the spending on police budgets, and then also
Those corporate handouts, they went through the same afternoon. No one had to wait for that. No one had to be online. People call these unemployment offices here, and like people say they call 200 times a day for weeks. I'm lucky enough to still be working. We're doing digital teaching and stuff, but people, like, they can't, they can't get through. They can't pay their rent. It's a nightmare.
We have at the moment, there's kind of our own government are kind of moving into action to vilify people who are taking these payments, even though there's mass, like it's the major numbers of people out of work, and our government responded with a €350 package. It was initially lower, and stated that initially that, oh, this is what someone can live on. Then they realized, actually, people can't live on this, we need to boost it up to 350.
And how much is like the average rent?
Oh, in Dublin, it's skyrocketed. It really has skyrocketed. But it was kind of an admission from the government that, oh, actually 350 is what someone needs to live on. And now they're trying to roll that back by painting it as in, they're saying that, oh, people are lucky to be on this. There's a lot of people who wouldn't have been making that type of money. So you can already see that kind of retrenchment from the government to kind of pit people back against each other. We could probably draw a comparison with the uprisings going on in Minnesota at the moment, and how they've tried to paint it as like violent, rupturous, like chaotic type of demonstrations. People pointing towards the Target and the I think it was AutoZone, two companies which are like multi-billion-dollar companies who will claim out their insurance at the moment for it. What do you make of the media coverage of it?
Yeah, I mean, so the day of the first protest, when the narrative wasn't riots yet, the narrative was this guy was brutally killed by the police, and the community is in mourning and anger at another man who is just murdered in front of their eyes. I mean, if you've seen this video, they're saying, check his pulse. They're telling, check his 9 minutes. When that was the narrative, there was an article in the New York Times, but I had to dig through the pages. It wasn't on the front page. It wasn't on the next page. It wasn't on the next page. This was on their app. You had to really dig. And so that's burying it. They had no real interest in covering that story. Once the narrative was, they're setting things on fire and all this, guess what? Front page. Big letters all over there. So, I mean, that is irresponsible journalism, to say the least. That is the type of approach that gets people to the point of desperation where they feel like they have nothing left to, there's no way to enact real change because the real crimes get ignored. And what do you do about that? I think people are in a really desperate state. And of course, you want to compare that to the far right, where are these protests where people are saying, give me back my freedom. I don't want to, I don't want to be locked up, and I want to go back to work and open up the economy. I mean, a lot of these protests are AstroTurf protests that are, covered by, they got their funding and their outreach covered by a lot of the same billionaires that are pushing to try to trick these workers to going back early into unsafe working conditions, right? And those are covered, we want to hear both sides, and, even in the liberal media, I think it's quite respectful to a certain extent, and you just look also at the way the police views them and the police treats them is always responsible and respectful. But the first night before any of this burning happened in Minneapolis, I mean, they were using concussion grenades. The police were using concussion grenades. They didn't use a concussion grenade when people stormed the Capitol with guns saying, open the country back up. There was not a concussion grenade that I heard of. And so the difference of the police and the difference of the media is, it's, night and day.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, in that the differing response from the media and the government to those two demonstrations shows their attitudes towards movements seeking to preserve the status quo and those seeking to make fundamental changes in the way that this one is. And it can be very hard to break through this, but it does seem like there's been a good response. And what has that been like where you are?
So, I mean, I haven't heard any reactions yet to Trump's newest thing saying he's thinking about calling in the military.
Mm-hmm.
It is worth remembering the Watts Rebellion, the Watts riots of 1965, where the police had injured a pregnant woman and people rebelled in a similar way. And Martin Luther King called it the language of the unheard, right? And I think there's a lot of truth in that. What ended up happening is the National Guard was called in, and they ended up killing 34 people in Watts, which is a
Right.
city in the U.S. So that's really frightening. And I haven't heard specific responses just because of the time of day and that this is sort of just happening live. But there is a protest going to happen here in Seattle on Saturday, led by this guy, Andre Taylor, who called for it, who's the brother of someone who here in Seattle got killed by the police. Got no justice, and the prosecutor in Seattle said he wasn't going to prosecute because killing his brother fell within department guidelines. So the problem is widespread, and the response, I think, is widespread as well. We saw it spread to Columbus, saw it spread. I don't think that people will take a similar approach here in Seattle. I don't really anticipate that. But I think it's going to be a big a march and rally in solidarity with against this, police violence for sure. And I think those are popping up all over the place. I'm hearing reports from different DSA chapters that their local area is having one, or that they're taking an initiative with other organizations, whether it's the NAACP or a whole lot of other Black Lives Matter organizations, a lot of different community groups getting together and trying to give some expression to the anger. People can come together and can have that, but at the same time, I think people feel like, we've done that, and the killings continue. Right?
Yeah.
Like, it's about 1,000 people a year, and it's not well tracked. It's not tracked by the government, but the police kill 1,000 people a year. It was tracked for 2 years by the Guardian until they lost funding, I believe, to do that. But it was 1,000 people a year. And so if you take that math, you think since George Floyd was killed, they've already killed 10 more people. They weren't caught on camera. We don't hear about it, but I think it's important. The depth and breadth of the crisis is sometimes not understood, especially by the white working class here in the U.S., who has disproportionately less exposure to that. But it should be said that police also kill, by the numbers, more white folks every year. Of course, they're poor working class white folks,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's disproportionately less. But in absolute numbers, it is something that they are. It's
Yeah,
across
I had seen it,
across the
and it
gambit.
often cuts across class lines more than anything else. It's generally in like poorer areas that you get these kind of outbursts. And I think you make a good point that you see what's recorded. Even with Eric Garner, it was a similar thing. The video was online, and you could see the brutal force that the police used. But I think it's hard to link demonstrations like this to larger movements or to broader organizations where the energy will kind of be conserved and channeled in the right ways.
Yeah, there were. I mean, in the Black Lives Matter movement in its heyday, there were real attempts to bring together organizations. There's a movement for Black Lives, a coalition of over 100 organizations. There was like a lot of different organizations that came out of it, but something like the DSA, but specifically racial justice, I think hasn't really manifested. And so definitely there is, I think, a real concern that, like you said, things might burn quite brightly and then sort of die back down, and the frustration and desperation deepens. But I would hope, I hope, and I think I would be, I'm quite confident that some people who are involved in these things right now, especially the more prominent a role that DSA is able to play, will get involved in the DSA and will continue that organization, because continuing that, solidifying that anger into ongoing discussion and action and a place to get organized and have a response to these things, and also just be pushing in a consistent way. It just makes so much more efficient the energy. It's like these, mass protests that are more spontaneous and don't kind of keep that energy sort of organized and moving forward. It can burn out brightly and then, like you said, and then sort of dissipate. And that's, not enough to meet the task. But it ends up being that I think I don't blame people for drawing a conclusion that it's hopeless, because
Mm-hmm.
there's
Mm-hmm.
been so much anger, so much action, so many attempts at this point, and what do we have to show for it? I think that's what this was so reminiscent of Eric Garner. I think that's something that really hit home, that he was saying, I can't breathe, that it felt like in 6 years, where have we gone,
Yeah, I think at times like this, it's very tough to maintain a perspective of what's been gained over the last couple of years. And this is coming at an especially difficult time for the left in America, in that one of the major movements, the Bernie Sanders campaign, has begun to wind down. And there's that danger that the energy that built up around this gets lost without like a coherent direction. So where does the left in America go from here, and how would you assess the situation?
Well, definitely the Bernie Sanders campaign this time, even more than the last, was a real multiracial coalition of working class forces who wanted to fight for a better world. I think much deeper roots, and I think a lot of times to myself how much more hope we would have if Bernie
Mm-hmm.
Sanders was a potential nominee, how this would be shaping the reaction. I haven't heard Joe Biden's reaction to Trump's things, but I can almost like imagine it in my head.
Yeah.
It's like super flat and like, you shouldn't be saying you're going to shoot people.
Yeah,
That's
it's
bad.
tonal like
Right.
criticisms. Yeah. Yeah.
Which
Very
is just
superficial.
like the most, it's not just like aggravating or cringeworthy. It has a real cost, right? And people have something to fight for. If those efforts are organized and put in a forward direction, it becomes so much more powerful. The world can be changed. And with him dropping out right now, I think not playing a great role.
Mm.
He's really sort of trying to, make sure people support Joe Biden and focusing his efforts there. I haven't heard his reaction to what's happening in Minneapolis, but I'm sure it's pretty good. But from the standpoint of the DSA,
Mm.
we've had over 15,000 people join the DSA since Bernie Sanders dropped out. Now over 65,000. But the DSA is very much dedicated trying to organize the efforts of these people so that people don't just become, disillusioned and drop out of politics.
Mm-hmm.
I think if
Yeah.
we look at like 5 years ago, if I'd said to you 5 years ago that a Democratic Socialist in the United States would almost win the nomination for president, would you believe me?
No, it's crazy. It's
So we
insane.
should
It's
see how far we've come, right? Like not get
disheartened.
yeah, exactly, that's
Yeah.
the word.
Did you see that picture? It's like a socialist book club in 2010, and it
Uh-huh.
was like they were over the moon with 3 members, and then it
Saw
was
this
like
thing.
socialists in 2020, and it was like oh, I can't believe we came second in a very close race to become president. Um,
It sums it up perfectly, right?
it's
There's
so
a lot
good.
to be
Yeah.
hopeful for.
Yeah.
It may not look like it based on where the world's going. Environmental catastrophe
Mm-hmm.
coming, COVID crisis being just just overwhelmingly dominated by the arguments of big business on both sides, racialized killings by the police. Like this is a horrible world that we live
Mm-hmm.
in, but
Mm-hmm.
there are those real
Yeah.
reasons to be hopeful. People are moving and doing and wanting to change things, and they feel like enough is enough. And that's the time when things can really change. The Watts Rebellion in 1965 were not a happy time,
No.
right? But that was a critical part of a process in the 60s that moved us towards so many reforms, towards a movement that stopped the war in Vietnam, towards a movement that won major environmental reforms. I don't know where the environment would be right now, honestly, if a lot of those things hadn't gotten passed. It delayed things.
Mm-hmm.
It gave us Roe v. Wade here, which was, ability to have abortions. All of these things, which are ultimately being peeled back, and it wasn't, ultimately successful. We don't live in a socialist utopia right now,
Mm-hmm.
but that is part of that process. The world looked so bad, and the world was looking worse, in part because people were fed up with it and were pushing back. And so that's that's definitely a reason to be hopeful, is
Yeah,
people are getting organized.
yeah, I think there's a lot of positives to be taken from the movements that you mentioned, and I think Bernie's campaign as well pointed to an alternative. But just to go back to the point on the DSA, which is operating at the moment within the Democratic Party in some way, they're running people within the Democratic Party line, and there's been a lot of discussion since Bernie dropped out about the best way forward for the left. And yourselves in Reform and Revolution have argued that the DSA and other left groups behind the Bernie campaign should at this stage begin forming a Democratic Socialist Party exterior to the Democratic Party, but that they should also continue to use their line. How would this function, and how do you see this playing out?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, so for like, I guess listeners who maybe don't like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not the same as like, as I understand sort of every other country that I've sort of looked at, your political system, like these parties, they're not like parties so
Mm-hmm.
much. They're so nebulous because it's really at its core, it's just a sort of funnel of corporate money that comes down the pipe. And then there's a totally divorced just a base that people that just vote for, say, the Democrats, and even the Republicans,
Mm-hmm.
um, who vote on certain social issues primarily, and just little things here. But basically, it's so there have been so many attempts to break away from the Democratic Party that
Yeah.
people have seen as failed. And so how do you really do this? How do you really do it in this really undemocratic system? Like, you can't even get on the ballot as a third party in some places. And
Yeah.
if you do, the voting system is so undemocratic that the sort of argument you hear blasted in your ears is you're just feeding votes to the Republicans.
Yes.
But really, it's the voting system that does it. And the Democratic Party, when in absolute power, has never tried to change this system, right? They could have made it more democratic in many, many ways, but instead they just complain how it's undemocratic when Trump doesn't win the popular vote or whatever. Like, so how do you do it? And I think there's a really good conversation happening in DSA, and it's not a simple, do we run as Democrats, or do we sort of make our own party?
Mm.
Because the hurdles are super real. Like, let's say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, New York.
Yes.
So she's got 26 challengers.
Yeah, it
She's
seems
got,
major.
yeah, sort of like they did with Bernie, right? Throw everyone at her and see
Yeah.
what sticks, right? It's open season against AOC. If she gave up the Democratic Party ballot line there, she couldn't run in the primaries for that seat. Instead, she would be outside of all of that. She would give up a really important ballot line that people are going to vote for her on, and she would have a much less chance of winning. And if she lost, that would be a big hit to the movement. That would be a big hit to people fighting for a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, racial justice. She has championed so many of those things. For her to be defeated would send that message, and the establishment would ride that all the way to the bank. I don't think she should give that up. I think that's a fight we want to make sure that we win. And there are a lot of people, you ask anyone in the DSA, you say, what do you think of the Democratic Party? They will give you so many four-letter words and expletives.
Appropriately,
yeah. But so there's no one who's saying, the Democratic Party is really good. That's not happening. But what is the tactics to get there? And I'm of the opinion, like, sort of contrary to what I just said, I'm of the opinion that the DSA should move to help lead other forces together to build a Democratic Socialist Party
Yes.
in the not too distant future. But sort of the if we build it, they will come mentality has failed in the US many times. The hurdles are extremely real. And so a lot of people are saying, this is sort of the dominant Jacobin position, is running on the Democratic ballot line is working. We sort of run in a hostile way, but we should keep it up. We should keep putting good platforms out there, good, what they call class struggle candidates.
Yeah.
And fighting to win. And in the future, absolutely, when we're strong enough, we should start pushing for an independent party. Now, I think a lot of that is true. Where I would differ, and where Reform and Revolution differs on that, is we can't wait for a future time to start doing that prep work.
Yeah.
The DSA should be having robust internal discussions now about a Democratic Socialist Party, what that would look like. What are any and all steps we can take? Like, to go back to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I don't want to get too, in the weeds with this, but there are voter laws in New York which allow for what they call fusion voting. You can run on two
Yeah.
different ballot lines at the same time, right? But could AOC and the DSA there also run her on a socialist ballot line, on a Democratic Socialist ballot line? They could, and they could champion for people to vote for her as a Democratic Socialist, if that makes sense,
Hmm.
not as a Democrat, and gauge a bit how much support they can build for people voting for her on that second ballot line, and link that to building conferences and people getting active and building a real on the ground campaign, and having conferences nationally, and calling on these elected officials, these DSA elected officials, come together, bring together some of the progressive unions, the couple of them that are supporting the Democratic Socialist candidates, because there's a growing number all the time of DSA elected officials, some of them who are already not
Hmm.
even getting elected as Democrats,
Yeah.
but sort of every inroad we can make right now to push in that direction, while not sort of just taking a if we build it they will come mentality. I think that's been the approach of R&R.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that because I think something like the Bernie campaign shows the forces that are constantly moving against you when operating in the Democratic Party. And I think you can even see it. You mentioned people like Ocasio Cortez and the intense pressure that they're under at the moment to move to the right, and how kind of isolated they are doesn't come through. So I think now, at the time when the Bernie campaign is just winding down, while the energy is still there among all these different organizations, I think there needs to be a driving force to move toward formation of a Democratic Socialist Party. Because I think failing to do that, by the time that break happens, this energy could be exhausted. But it's about tapping into it as early as possible, because you might not get an opportunity like this again.
When's that perfect time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's so easy to say, well, it's not quite the right time.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of, I think, a trap of putting it off. And unfortunately, Bernie Sanders is giving the lead. But I mean, there's sort of no time like the present, but we should be real about sort of not having, like, there was a call from Shama Sawant here in Seattle
Yeah.
to sort of, we're going to launch a party next year and come out to it. Like, let's do it. Let's have a conference this year and launch a party next year. And I think that approach is too rigid on the other side. I understand the
Yeah.
sentiment. I'm very sympathetic because I want to do that too. But you also, Jacobin has a point. You want to make sure it doesn't fail. But the more Democratic Socialists are winning in the Democratic Party primaries, the more the pushback will be. We saw the big pushback from the media and the establishment against Bernie. It'll just ramp up and up and up. What happens if this is a private club at the end of the day? What happens if the Democratic Party establishment changes the rules and makes it so we can no longer keep doing this?
Yeah.
Running on the Democratic Party ballot line becomes more restricted. That wouldn't be the first time, right? Democrats were highly involved in the Red Scare in the 50s.
Yeah.
They've done all this stuff before. Loyalty pledges to the government and the big companies and all this stuff. It's not beyond what,
The
what
pale.
history
Yeah.
shows can happen. So what happens if that should happen tomorrow? How organized are we? How much have we really built? How prepared are we to respond to that? Or are we scattered by that? Are we like, oh no, our tactic is gone. What do? We don't know. I think we just want to be as organized as possible and ready for that, because that's some of the things that I think would sort of tip the scale towards more wider numbers of people being like, what? You can't run as a Democrat and support Medicare for all or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
that makes it, you could
That
grab
heightens the
whole
kind of
new
contrast.
sections of
Mm-hmm.
people that would understand that more, and then can shift the balance towards the need for a new party. And if you can be organized and prepared for that, that can have a vessel to actually be built into. But like you said, that takes a while.
Yeah, it can be extremely tough to decide which path to take, especially with so much harm being caused by the status quo at the moment. But I think it's vital to point people away from the Democratic Party, and that might actually not be as difficult, seeing as they've chosen someone like Joe Biden to be their candidate for the upcoming election. How do you view that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, he's doing something that no one thought was possible. He's making Hillary Clinton look in touch and relatable, but truly. And on top of that, just I mean, his misogyny,
Mm.
racism. He has a rape allegation against him that seems
Yeah.
even more credible
Kavanaugh.
than Kavanaugh, the one
Yeah,
against Kavanaugh.
really
And
is.
yet you see so many people who were, champions of, don't let Kavanaugh take the bench for this accusation, who are now Biden apologists. And I
Yeah.
think that is so traumatizing and disgusting to see, for anyone who's been a victim of sexual
Yeah.
violence to see that. And I think it's just such hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's fucking awful. And I think it just reveals the kind of material interests that were always at the heart of and the concerns. And I think this relates to what we were saying about how those material interests kind of galvanized the party in opposition to Bernie. You've seen, like, it went from, what, 5 candidates to two within, like, 4 days or something. And the way
Oh,
they
it
kind
was
of.
like within 3 hours. It was just before Super Tuesday. So
Yes.
that
Yeah.
decisive day,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone lined up, and they all released their press statements,
Yeah.
and they all had it ready, and the press was out and with a million articles. I mean, it
Yeah.
was the most prepared thing I'd ever seen. I'm not someone who usually underestimates how much like the billionaire class is
I did it
organized,
too.
but
Yeah, I
I
did it
was
too.
surprised. I
Yeah.
did a double take. I couldn't believe. It just shows, like, no matter how much of a clown car they may look like, they know how to, get in line behind their candidate when the time comes.
Yeah, really, despite their weakened position, they're still able to come together in the interests of capital. And I think that's the reason why it's so important for the left to come together in opposing this. And shows why the work you guys are doing in Reformer Revolution and the DSA is so important. And that's really where the bright spots are, despite all the issues that are cropping up as tough as they might be to take.
There's a lot there that is really getting people to say enough is enough. And I think it's petrifying that, we have a government or a series of governments that thinks that during a pandemic it's okay to put off, say, the COP26 conference to discuss climate change and what to
Mm-hmm.
do about it, but the police killings, go forward. The I think mass incarceration, right, where you've got people who are either detained for immigration. You've got millions of people locked up in prisons where this virus is running wild. That's gotta Can't let people out of prison. Can't let nonviolent inmates out of prison. Right?
Yeah.
That would be too much. Oh, but let's turn a blind eye to the crises. Let's bail out these big corporations. Let's make sure that this all of this violence continues, and it just it is getting to I think a real boiling point. And DSA is just a bit like like a dog that still thinks it's a puppy,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
it's like a big dog and it jumps on your lap and you go, oh, you know what I mean? Like it's like you're not a puppy anymore. Like, there's a bit of that in DSA where I think a lot of people still, like, sort of in DSA, sort of still see us as like a small organization.
Yes.
How
Okay.
much impact can we have? And that's really changing, and grappling with that and starting to actually give a lead to a lot of these struggles and helping to play a leading role in bringing different coalitions and organizations together. Really, the idea that we could challenge the Democratic Party, I think for a lot of people, it's still and in many, it still is. It's David and Goliath, right? But
Mm-hmm.
David won, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the conversation that's starting to be out there of, without Bernie Sanders at the forefront anymore, it's sort of, it is not me, us,
Yes.
as sort of was the campaign slogan. And I think the fight for racial justice and the fight for gender justice and against environmental catastrophe are wrapped up completely in the fight for democratic socialism.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've seen the last huge wave of people getting organized. I think that's still coming. So that is a bright spot.
Yeah, I really think you've captured the reasons to be optimistic in that, and I think that's probably the best note that we're going to get to wrap things up. So, once again, thanks a million for coming on and going through this with us.
Thanks for having me on. This is great.
No problem at all. But that's going to be us for this week. Thanks a million, everyone, for listening in. You can find more information on what we've discussed, along with social media for the show, in the episode description. Thanks a million. See you all later.